Greetings and salutations, Geonerds! So what's this thumping great big dam on the north side of Brisbane and the lake behind it got to do with this beautiful regal old home up in the valley? Well, really, it's under the dam now, and this 800-year-old church in Gloucestershire in England. Well, you'll have to hang around. Let's find out together. Hey folks, just a quick drop in. This is an unusual video. You've got about 12 minutes of video, but then you've got a nearly 30-minute interview with William Joyner, one of the last surviving Joyners. So you'll see it in the chapter markers. I really think you should listen to the guy. He's absolutely fantastic, but you know, it's a long video. You might have 2 goes at it. Anyway, let's get on with the show. Hey Geonerds, today we're going to have a look at this place and its history. Ost House, or Samsonvale House, was on a property called Samsonvale. Theme here, right? So let's go and have a look at where it is first. So here we are, we're in the city, of course. This time we're over South Bank. There's the wheel. We're going to head north because, you know, that's where it is. Just gone past Sparks Hill there. Well, we've run out of 3D again. They're going to fix that one day. We're going to zoom up here to the North Pine Dam, or the North Pine River actually, which is here it is. We're going to whiz up the valley here to the North Pine Dam, because Samsonvale House is now under the North Pine Dam, or Lake Samsonvale's not under the dam. That's the big bricky wally thing, the dam. The lake is called Lake Samsonvale. But here we go, up to the upper reaches of course, and that hill we can see there is of course Joyners Hill. And that little patch peninsula you can see there is where Samsonvale House was. We'll look at a little more detail in that. I've got something more. There's not much to see. It's been gone for a while. So anyway, pull back just to let you know where we are. We're not far out of Brisbane. You can walk there if you can. Anyway, let's get on with it. Hey Geonerds, we're going to start at the very beginning.
A very good place to start.
And I'm talking about the very beginning. I'm talking October 1823. A guy called Charles Penson. He commanded the HM cutter Mermaid, who brought Oxley up here on his first journey. Now, you know, this guy's not a big part of this story, but his daughter certainly is. Anyway, very sad story, Charles Penson. If you get a chance to read it, it was a great time not to be destitute in Victorian times. But anyway, he died quite young. He had some children. One of those children's name was Isabella Penson. Now, Charles Penson's ex-wife, also Isabella Penson, must have been fun, to make ends meet, and they were really destitute, this family. They had the wolves at the door. You should read the story. It's a tearful story. While the guy's dying on his bed, they've got bailiffs being sent in by banks to take the furniture away. Victorian times, lovely stuff. Nothing's changed really. Anyway, she took in boarders, and one of the boarders she took in was a young Englishman called William Joyner. Now, the Joyners, again, didn't arrive here with, $10 and a T-shirt, not intending to change either. The Joyners were well-to-do families from England, and young Isabella Penson, had had enough of poverty. So she ended up getting married to William Joyner in Sydney, and they were doing business in Sydney. He saw the development of Brisbane. She was already pregnant by then. He came up here to set up what became Samsonvale. Now, in travelling back and forwards to Sydney, he went on this boat, the Sovereign. The steamer went backwards and forwards, and unfortunately on one of its journeys it floundered off Stradbroke Island, and the Local Aboriginal people saved 10 of the 54 people on board, but unfortunately William was not one of them. So Isabella found herself a widow in Sydney with a young child and a property in Queensland to run. So before we go much further into the Joyner saga, we need to talk about the Griffins and Whiteside. I've purposely not covered Whiteside much because it's, these people weren't particularly nice people. They were cruel to their servants. They were absolutely brutally cruel to the local Aboriginal people, including a massacre of unknown quantity of people. And Tom Petrie's got very little nice to say about them. That's good enough for me. So anyway, the Griffins came here from the Orkney Islands. Captain George Griffin was a sea captain. His sons Francis, William and John all came out from the Orkney Islands, and they took up this land. They were the first ones in the area, from Moreton Bay to Daybra, everything north of the North Pine River to Caboolture. That is an enormous property, which got taken off them one slice at a time over the years. They sold the eastern part of the property, east of the North Pine River, to Tom Petrie. It was called Redbanks. He renamed that to Marumba, which was his property. Never had any problem with Aboriginal people, nothing stolen. Yet on this side of the river, lots of trouble, because these people were just assholes. Nobody liked them. The Griegers didn't like them, the ones up north. The Youngs didn't like them. The Joyners originally didn't like them, but that changed a bit. So what happened to Isabella? Well, it gets worse than that. The old man, who was George Griffin, particularly aggressive towards the Aboriginals, Francis came up here, set the property up, and with William, old man George comes up from Sydney and basically chucks Francis out, just on your bike, chucks all his gear out, and he had to go. They had a disagreement, which they had lots of. William and John came up and they were running it with him, and eventually, to cut a very long story short, with lots of fighting and backstabbing, John and Isabella got married. So Isabella, who was the widow, of course, of William Joyner, became Isabella Joyner Griffin. And you'll see her listed on a lot of these maps you're about to see as Isabella Griffin. I understand she needed a hand to run the property. The Griffin property was in decline, and Samsonvale was a much better property. So I can see it was mutual for them, I think. So John and Isabella were married in 1852 in Sydney, in fact. You'd think they'd be a bit scared of steamships by now. But Griffin moved into Samsonvale then, and they started building a fine house. And initially they called it Ost House, which is named after the village in England that William Joyner originally came from. So I'll just put up a little piece of that piece of England, and the church, which you saw in the intro, is the church in Ost, the village in England that he came from. So by now, Isabella Joyner's son from her original marriage is becoming a young man, William, and he's starting to help her around the property, and he looks like a fine young man. All reports, good operator, no problems, doesn't appear to have the Griffin issue. With, let's say, getting along with other people. Most people like this guy. So here he is a little later in life with his young son, and his young son's name is William, I think, as well. And that young fella, that baby you see there, is the grandfather of the guy that you're about to hear some oral history from. An actual Joyner descendant who grew up in that house. So hang in there for that. It's a little further down the track yet. Now folks, this is a foundation letter. This is from William, talking about his father and who's there, and they've gathered and why they're laying the stone and who it's named after, in his own handwriting, right, from 1865. Pause it, read it. I'm not going to read it to you. Pause it and read it. It's absolutely fantastic. I'll put it on high enough resolution, you should be able to do that. So here it is, Samsonvale House. No longer there, of course, because Lake Samsonvale This is over the years. It didn't change that much. It got just lived in. The family was there. And at the end of this video, I'm going to run quite a long video. It's an interview from the Pine Rivers Library, interviewing one of the Joyner descendants. He's a lovely old man. It's worth a listen. But you know, this is already a very long video. Here it is. You can see the ridge in the background there. Here it is in the geography. So that big lump of trees in the middle is Joyner Hill. And that little circle down the bottom there, keep an eye on that, that's Gold's Scrub. And here we are again, Joyner Hill. There it is. This is the 1960s. It's gone. They're pulling it all down. Notice Gold Scrub still there. Here's the 1970s. Here comes the dam. Here comes the water. She's all gone. That's the way it is. So what I'll do now is we'll look at the geology and the LiDAR right at the end of the video like an idiot. But anyway, we'll get there. Well, folks, here's a LiDAR. Wouldn't be a T-Rocks video if we didn't do this. That's where it was there. Can you see something possibly? Don't know. Have to go on the ground. I just thought I'd flick this up. This is Gold Scrub. This is an area of original hoop pine that has never been touched. You should go and see this. This is a magnetic dipole anomaly map, and that pink is a massive magnetic anomaly, let me tell you, and it's right underneath, directly underneath their house. Here's the geology. This is complicated. I'm not going to do it in this video, but they say the North Pine Fault runs right through the middle of that dam, as we've said before, and they are sitting on a piece of the Mount Sanford granodiorite. As you can see here, it goes right underneath their place. Joyner Hill is a piece of the Mount Sanford granodiorite, so it's all rocky, nasty, hard, beautiful rock actually, sitting underneath them there. Now, William Joyner decided to go into politics. He was actually elected to the Caboolture board, divisional board in 1880. He resigned in 1881, but as you can see, we do it differently in Queensland. This was part of his electoral campaign. Anyway, I'm going to introduce you to another Joyner right now. He's going to talk to you.
Well, the first thing I think I should do is to introduce myself. My name is William Graham King Joyner. That's like most genealogists find, they've got funny little things in their names. The William, of course, goes with the family. My father was Wilfred Stanley Joyner, and I was born in Atherton, up in the North Queensland, on the 21st of June 1928. I was there because my father and mother were there, and my father was in the forestry, and he was a long way away from his original home, which was Samsonvale. He was the third son of William Charles Joyner and Louisa Fuller. And to take it one step further back, William Charles was the only child of William Joyner and Isabella Penson. Well, that fixes me in a genealogical sense into the Joyner family. Being born in North Queensland, I didn't come to Samsonvale until I was about probably 4 years old, I would think. Maybe 5, I'm not too sure about that. Unfortunately, I didn't write it down at the time. But Samsonvale was a home. It was the centre of the family. We always regarded ourselves, if you could put it in inverted commas, as the Joyners of Samsonvale. And as a small child, of course, I took very little notice of things. Later on, I draw on the recollections of my life at that stage. But of course, at that stage, young children weren't encouraged to be inquisitive. So all of these things are drawn from my memory. And strangely enough, I find that my memory was fairly retentive at that stage of my life. I'm grateful for that. So we used to come down to Samsonvale, not every year, at that stage when we lived in North Queensland, but later on, when we lived in the Mary Valley, we were at Samsonvale quite often. We used to come down, for instance, at Christmas time, and we might have been there for maybe 6 weeks. Perhaps my father wasn't there all the time, but we would stay there as children. And that's when we started to learn something about the history of the place. My grandmother was a very proper English lady, not the kind of person you would ask questions of, and she was definitely the leader of the family. We hear a lot about the leadership given by women in the early days, and in my particular family it was extraordinarily true. The women outlived the men by many, many years, and survival was dependent on the leadership of the women of the family. And my grandmother, who was known affectionately as Gran, and a grand old lady she was certainly the leader of the family. The old house fascinated me. By that stage, the original shingle roof had gone. It had a galvanised iron roof, but apart from that, the house hadn't been fundamentally changed since it was built. 1865, and I think the builder was a firm called Campbell's, but maybe I'm wrong on that. But anyhow, it was a large, imposing, two-storey cedar house with beech floors and these two great chimneys that probably bound it together and made it secure. There were fireplaces on both floors in two places, and at this climate the fire wasn't used very much, but in winter time it would be lit, and it was always a focal point of family activity. It seemed to me that it was, in those days, a long way out, and of course in the early days it was even much further. And when I read back into the early history of the family, and you know, if they wanted to go into Brisbane in a hurry, you know, you'd gallop off on a horse. But other times it'd be on a bullock wagon or in a horse and dray, and there weren't many crossings of the rivers, so they had to find easy ways to cross, or perhaps there were punts in certain times. But it was fascinating. It was like living back into another age to go there. And looking back, one of the things that fascinated me was how the other members of the family didn't seem to want to stay there. They always seemed to move out. My father, for instance, he moved out. My uncle Villiers, proper name William Henry Villiers Joyner. We seem to have a tendency to drop early surnames, Christian names. He went off, he worked for the government, he was a valuer, but a little bit of digression on him. A strange kind of an existence in a way. He was a bachelor until he married late in life, and the marriage was short-lived. But every Monday morning he'd head off into Brisbane, and he'd stay at the City View Hotel. So he was a resident, a permanent resident there. From Monday to Friday, that's where he lived. Friday afternoon, hop in the car and come out to Samsonvale. And he seemed to be the only man around the place who ever did anything. And as a small child, I used to follow him around the place, and he'd go out into the run. Of course, the run was only a residue of what the original run was, but that was some of the back paddocks. And he'd do a bit of fencing and a bit of fiddling around like that. But most of the work that happened on Samsonvale was done by two sets of share farmers. One set lived quite close to the old house, and the other set lived perhaps 3/4 of a mile away over towards Cobble Creek. The youngest male member of the family was my uncle Alan, and he lived just on the other side of Cobble Creek. And well, he lived there until sometime after my cousin died, when he was accidentally shot there. So he was the only male that was there close by, and yet he was fairly isolated. In those days, the telephone only came into Samsonvale House, and I can recall in the hallway down where the stairs went upstairs, there was one large telephone on the wall, one of these things with a great handle you'd wind, and beside it there was a smaller one, and that was connected to my uncle's house by a line that wound around the trees and went over to his place, which was called Derwentwater, and I'd love to find out why. But one of these days I'll find out why he called it Derwentwater. And there was always this curious way of him contacting the outside world. He would ring through on the little line that went across, and then someone at Samsonvale would ring the number, and they would hold the two phones together. And it must have been a pretty ineffective system, but apparently it worked enough for them to get messages through. So what was Samsonvale like in those days? Well, around Christmas time, when the family seemed to gather there, it was a time of great storytelling. I can remember my father and my Uncle Villiers and my aunt's husband, Ben Cortis, who was a politician. A rather nice politician, I might say. Very, very, very nice chap. They would sit and have these great arguments. Arguments that didn't ever get terribly heated, but quite vigorous about their various political viewpoints. And of course, as children, we were not encouraged to interfere with these things. You know, these were adult things, and children really shouldn't be interfering in politics. But they'd have these great long conversations. And Christmas time, of course, was a time for feasting. In those days, chicken was something you associated with particularly, you know, festive occasions, maybe a sucking pig. I can remember one vividly, killing a sucking pig with enormous noise from the pig, which turned up not very long afterwards with an apple in its mouth on the dining room table. But after a heavy meal, and they were heavy meals, you know, everyone would retire to rest and to digest. And the kids were made to quietly walk around so they wouldn't disturb anyone. And we always thought it was a great waste of time. You know, we'd had a good meal, we wanted to do something. But nobody else wanted to do anything, they just wanted to sit down and digest. So these were the kind of days that I recall there. But I also recall some of the things that I was told about the days before that. For instance, in my father's family there were 7 boys and 2 girls. I always thought they were born in Samsonvale House, but that wasn't so. They didn't come to live in Samsonvale House until my great-grandmother, who was in a later stage of her life, was Isabella Griffin. She was born Isabella Penson, married William Charles, and of course William Charles was drowned when the Sovereign went down in 1847. And after that time, Isabella Joyner and her mother, Isabella Penson, quite confusing to have them both named Isabella, came up from Sydney, where they were living at the time, and with my grandfather, William Charles, who was probably about 15 months old. And this is what I say about the women who, with their determination, they were the ones that held the family together. I often wonder about these 2 ladies. Isabella the elder was born in Scotland, and she was obviously had great determination, that trait of Scottish people to be so determined and dogged. She lost her husband when her children were quite young. He was a sea captain. And as a matter of divergence from around about the Pine, he brought Oxley up here when Oxley first did his survey of Moreton Bay area for a convict settlement. He was master of the ship called the Mermaid. When the first convict settlement was started and they came up in the Amity, Charles Penson was also the master of the Amity. But he died rather suddenly and left his wife, a widow, in Sydney. A lot of this is only background, and it may not have much to do with Samsonvale, but it talks about the character of the people who ended up here. So Isabella Penson and her daughter and several sons lived in Sydney, and I think she had a little school. I think she had a sort of a boarding house. And when my great-grandfather, William Joyner, came out in 1840, he lived in that house and married the landlady's daughter, which, you know, seemed a rather sort of a convenient way to find yourself into the community of Sydney at that stage. He was setting up this place here in Samsonvale, and he had a managing partner by the name of William Mason, who was actually living here while great-grandfather was actually living in Sydney and commuting up and down. And there are various stories about how he travelled. Some people say he travelled by bullock wagon, and he could have at one stage, but most of the time he travelled by ship, and it was on the ship that went down that started the decline of the family fortunes, I'm sure. But the two ladies came up, and with great perseverance, they kept things together. And life wasn't the most pleasant in these times, you know. There was a certain amount of angst with the Aborigines around the place, although by, say, 1849, they were tending to become less aggressive than they had been. There was still spearing of cattle and things going on, but they weren't quite as aggressive as they had been. So, to get back to my where I diverted from several years ago, the family of my father's family were actually born in a house that was not far away from the main house. And I suspect that was the house which eventually was taken over by one of the share farmers. So it wasn't until Isabella Joyner, later Griffin, died that they moved into the big house. Off the top of my head, I haven't got her death date, but it's in the records. So, we're back in Samsonvale House, built 1865, and it was really an imposing building. It was designed to have two wings. One wing was the kitchen area, and this was a device to prevent fires from consuming the rest of the house. Not that the kitchen ever took fire as far as I know, although I do recall one of my aunts telling a story once about a fire, but there's some doubt as to whether she was pulling their legs or not, and I think she might have been. That was another aunt. That was Ben Cordis's wife, Elsie. Elsie also left the place. She took up nursing, she became matron of hospitals, and that's where she met Ben Cordis, because he was, I think, chairman of the hospital board in Bundaberg. The only person that really stayed there for all her life, well, for all her life until Samsonvale was sold, was Izzy. Now, Izzy was a nickname, of course. Her real name was Frances Louise. Louise after her mother, and I'm not sure where Frances came from, but, well, that's debatable. She was a remarkable lady. She was the one who cared for her mother and arranged things around the house and probably organised a lot of things that needed to be done without doing them herself. She was kindness itself. She was the very, very model of a Christian lady, a lovely lady, kind, firm, loving, and the one who, after my grandmother died, maintained all the contacts with the family. There has to be somebody who writes to everybody and remembers people's birthdays and does all those kind of things, and she was that. She lived to be, I think, about 96, 98. Longevity in the female side of my family is legion. Not so with the male side, but so far I'm doing okay. So Izzy was the one who kept the family together. But Christmas time, and they all came in, the family, their wives, the in-laws, the cousins, and there weren't many of them, I might add. Talk about family longevity, and the family also has had a few skinny times in its period. Of course, from those 9, in the next generation, there were only 4. My sister Beryl, and myself, and my 2 cousins, who were sons of Alan, who lived at Derwentwater, David and Peter. David was the elder. He was 4 years younger than I, and he started off to do some work in the city, didn't like the city, came back on the farm, loved the farm, but accidentally got shot. The story was that he kept his eye on a crow and pulled a gun out nose first, which was unbelievably impossible in the sense that he'd grown up with guns, but he was fixated by this crow apparently, and the gun went off, and that was the end of poor David. Peter was only 4 at the time, I'm sure. I think. Perhaps I'm wrong. But Peter's living and well, and his recollections of life at Samsonvale might be based more on what he's heard from his father than anything else. But he lived close to Samsonvale for quite a while. He's retired now and spends most of his life in Sydney and some of his life at Noosa, which sounds very good. Alan, my uncle, was a keen fisherman, and he used to grow crops that he'd air freight to Sydney, much to the dismay of local farmers who thought it was a ridiculous habit. But he was the most innovative person. But he might have been in the middle of harvesting a crop of beans or cucumbers and the market was good, and someone would say, the brim of biting at Caloundra or Noosa, and he'd drop everything and go fishing. He was an impulsive kind of a character. He used to write letters to the paper under the name of Pine Needles, and I've still got a few of his letters, and if you run across any old cuttings in the papers with the byline Pine Needles, that's my uncle, Alan Joyner. Of the boys, one died very young, one was killed in a jumping accident on the run. Another died up at Warwick, he'd left the place too. Three of them went to war. Ernest Southey Wish, what a name, what a name. Wish was of course after Claudius Buchanan Wish, who had a property up near Caboolture. Southey was the surname of his uncle, who was a missionary to China. Fascinating character. I only found out about him recently, and that's another story entirely. But we seem to have this habit of these multiple names. Poor old Ernie, he was killed on the Somme. I was over there a few years ago and I tried to find him, but apparently he was in multiple pieces, and while his name is up on the wall, I can't find a grave. My father went off in the Light Horse, which was the sort of the boy's own type of war, and he never talked very much about it, but got a few photos and letters. He used to write home to his mother in the most optimistic tones. Everything was fun and great, and he was fine and nobody could hurt him, you know. He got a few holes in him, but only minor, I think. Alan, of course, was the youngest in the family, and he couldn't go to the war until the war was nearly finished. And my father, who was the adjutant of his regiment, exercised his right to have his sibling attached to him. And by that time, things were pretty well over. They just about pushed the Turks back, and I think my father had been up to Damascus, and Alan came over there and just had a ball, which was very nice for him. He was, as I said, he was the impulsive one. He was the one who wrote letters to the paper. And in the family they called him the poet. Not that I've seen any of his poems, but he was that kind of a person, you know, the dreamer, the impulsive person. And that just about runs through the individuals in the family. Perhaps I'd like to go back a little bit to the early days. I've really been fascinated to know what the circumstances were when Isabella arrived with her mother and the infant who was my grandfather. There were several houses on the property at that stage. I have recently found a pencil drawing, which I'm sure was done by Isabella, and I'm pretty sure it shows several of the original huts and the buildings that were up on the hill behind it, the barn, the milking bales and a few sheds like that. Now that would have been 1849, I think, from recollection, and the property was originally acquired in 1844. There has been some conjecture as to who was here first, the Griffins or the Joyners. I'm pretty sure it was the Griffins, and I'm quite happy not to argue about it. Curiously enough, after several years, quite a few years after great-grandfather was drowned, Isabella married John Griffin, and it was run mutually. I think they all lived at Samsonvale. Up behind the house there's an old cypress pine tree, and that was the station cemetery. There never were, to my recollection, any markers on the ground, but we all knew it was a cemetery there. And I know that buried there is my great-grandmother, her mother, my great-grandmother, old Mrs. Griffin, and also my great-grandmother's brother, Charles Penson. There could have been others too, I don't know, but of those four I'm pretty certain. They could tell some stories. They could tell some great stories. I'm fortunate, really, to have a lot of old letters. And I've got documents which my great-grandfather signed, but I have one letter which always intrigues me. He had written it from Brisbane when he'd come up on the Sovereign on his last trip. And he came into Brisbane and he talks about the people in town. He talks about Bowes, or Bowes, who ran a little hotel or hostel there. He talked about, he ran across old Petrie, blind as a bat. At that stage, when I first read it, I thought he must have meant that Petrie had had a bit too much to drink, but of course I recognised later on that it was his eyes. And then he met young Petrie, young Griffin, and he was going out to the property, and he sort of reminisced a bit about some other friends that he would like to have there and other people in the town. It's fascinating. And he talked about his son, and it was really quite a really passionate kind of a letter. I would have loved to have known him. I would have loved to have known him. He was the only son of a family of mainly girls, and when he left England, they didn't really want him to leave. And I only discovered recently that between the ages of 16 and 21 he was in America. So he had the wanderlust of the time. He didn't come out here for any other reason, I'm sure, than to sort of extend the empire. You know, these days of the British Empire the sun never sets on. And I'm sure that was in his mind. He was probably a romantic who wanted to be out here in this new country. His son, who he only knew as an infant, I think was he was probably a more unsuited to what you might call the life of a man on the land. The story is that he was intended for the church, but his health was not so good, but he was good enough to father 9 children. He died in 1900, I think, 1900, 1902, I'm not too sure, I should know that, and he's buried down there on the edge of the pine down there. He got quite involved in local affairs. I think he was a member of the Road Council, a forerunner to the Shire Council, and he may have been even on the council at one stage, I'm not too sure. It was sad. He would have died at the age of about early 50s, and that was pretty unfortunate. Again, left a widow to hold the family together. So this recurring thing of the women being the ones who kept the family together and kept things running. I guess it's the actuarial tables talk about longevity and men living shorter, but in those days the women had many, many years of additional life. Life wasn't that easy for them. There was no power, no electric power at Samsonvale in my recollection. Food was kept cool in a coolguardy safe, you know, the old things that hung on the veranda with a trough of water around them, and the water was drawn up. There was a well beside the house which we used to put watermelons and bags of beer. You may recall in those days beer used to come in a straw jacket, and it was in a bag, and you'd drop it down the well, and it kept it pretty cool. Not that I was drinking beer at the time, I must admit, but everybody else seemed to enjoy it. But there was no power, there were wood stoves, and cooking was, you know, in the summertime, must have been, you know, a really dreadful thing for the women to have to do in the heat of a summer and around Christmas time. No wonder they were exhausted after eating a big meal and had to go and have a sleep. But, yeah, the old house really fascinated me, and the one before it, I would have loved to have seen that. You know, they used cedar for all the things. The house, of course, was built of pit-hewn cedar, and it was a double-walled thing for insulation. But the bales and those working sheds, and there was cedar all through them too. It was unbelievable. And I'm sure that was one of the reasons why the house was demolished. Mr. Rogers, he was the second owner after it was sold in 1944. I've looked at the newspaper article of the auction at the time, and yes, and it didn't really produce much money at that stage, but I'm sure that was the reason why the house was demolished, to get the cedar, which would have probably been more valuable than what they bought the place for. And certain bits of the house have survived in the house that my aunt and uncle Curtis lived in. I think they had the mantelpiece there. But it lives in my memory. there was this great balustrade that came down in a big curve like that, and of course we weren't supposed to, but you couldn't resist sliding down it. And at the end there was a curl like that, and you had to slow down a bit, or you might get thrown off it like a bucking horse. And underneath the stairs there was this room of punishment that was always held there, as if we were misbehaved, we'd be put in the black hole. I think it was like the deterrent weapon. I never really got to deserve that kind of punishment, but it was always there in case I needed it. My grandmother was a gardener. She had a rose garden out in front, and she had ferns and hanging things all around the veranda, a big wide 10-foot veranda. And I think the constant watering of the plants there tended to deteriorate. I can remember looking at the edges of the veranda boards and thinking they were all starting to go off at the edges. And I think that was too much water from the plants. But anyhow, the house didn't live long enough to deteriorate. Unfortunately, it was pulled down. And I guess if it had survived some years longer, we might have realised its real worth in terms of its history value of the place, because it really was an outstanding house. You know, it stood up there on this ridge, and it looked out at the ridge across on the other side, and down below it was a feature that always fascinated me, a great clump of bamboos. It was hollow in the middle, and the bamboos met at the top, and you'd force your way through the bamboos and you'd be in this secret place. And at night when you were in bed, you could hear the creaking of the bamboos as the wind moved them around. It was quite an eerie sound, and it conjured up all kinds of childhood fantasies that you might have had at that stage. It stood on the banks of what we called the Black Gully. Black, the water wasn't black, of course, it was quite nice water, but it was black soil, and now of course it's all under the water, you can't see anything of that. The house side, of course, is well out of the water, sadly at this stage overgrown by a great excess of lantana, but it's easily recognisable because of the trees around the place, the remnants of the chimneys, the well, it is still there. Well, the top's gone off it, of course, but the hole's still there. I'm uncertain about who dug the well. I had a story as a child that my uncle Villiers used to scrape it out, pulling a scrape behind his car. But now I doubt that. I think he may have only done some cleaning out of it. Maybe it had silted up a bit. I think the origin of the well goes back earlier than that, because if he did that in a car, it would probably have been around the time of the First War. And I think it was there before that, I really do. But there we are, that's Samsonvale. I had a lot of fun there as a child. I'm most grateful for the memories that I have of it. And it would be wonderful if at some stage in the future other people could have some kind of a share in what this was as one of the early homesteads of this lovely area. Of course, it's under the shadow of Mount Sampson. Quite some years ago, when I was a bit more active than I am now, with a group of friends I decided to climb Mount Sampson. And I took my son up with me, and there were a few of my friends, and as we struggled up the side of the mountain, my son kept saying, "Oh, I'll have to buy a drink at the top, there's bound to be a kiosk up there, and I'll write my name in a book, on the visitor's book." And when we got up there, there was a can on top, and inside a tin was a small jar with a book in it, and we wrote our names in it. But I do have a photograph of my Aunt Izzy taken on top of Mount Sampson, so at some stage of her early life she climbed it too. Of course from there you've got a fantastic view across the whole of the area of Samsonvale. The area of it, obscure in my mind. Originally it was a run, it was never surveyed to my knowledge. Subsequently it was a Crown lease, said to have been 20 square miles, 12,800 acres. I don't know the boundaries of that, and when it got down to the preemptive purchase, of course the freehold boundaries are easy to define, but what it was in the beginning, nobody knows. And what it is now, a lot of people don't know either. So there we are. That's my story.